Just a couple of questions I'd like to ask our panelists. Last year, according to Business Week a couple of months ago, the CEOs of major corporations earned a 54% increase in their compensation. Workers earned a 3% increase in their compensation. CEOs of major corporations now make over 200 times what their workers earn. I would ask both of the gentlemen, what's your assessment of that situation? Is that a good situation for the United States of America? And what, if it's not, what should we do about it?
Congressman, I think we share your both outrage and puzzlement at those numbers. The growth of inequality in this country during the last 20 years has been shameful. It is partly accounted for by a lack of opportunities, a lack of investment in human beings who find themselves at the bottom of the labor market. But it's partly accounted for by outrageous salaries and associated perquisites. As a moral issue, as a question of what kind of a society do we want to be, how do we share the fruits of our productivity, it's suggestive of some quite ugly things. I would point out that we cannot fix what ails the bottom of the labor market. We cannot address the problems that low-income workers face simply by somehow appropriating or extracting the compensation of the very wealthy. We need a fast-growing economy. We need tighter labor markets. We need policies that invest in those men and women. We ought not to simply think there's a one-for-one trade-off here, but the pattern that you described is one that we deplore.
Sir. Gentleman from the National Association of Manufacturers.
You raised two issues, one of them being inequality in incomes, which has to do with the fact that wages were depressed in the early 1990s, and I indicated earlier, I think that a large part of the problem was simply the fact that we had too much slack in labor markets. We had an unemployment rate briefly over 7% and a natural rate of unemployment probably less than 5%. As a result, it was not until the last couple of years that you've gotten back to a situation of near full employment, and as a result, the outlook for wages and wage increases in particular is going to be much better in the late 1990s than it was in the early 1990s. Now, another dimension of the inequality, of course, has to do with ownership of wealth, and in fact, most CEOs are not paid huge salaries. They are paid in stock options, and one of the reasons that their total compensation has gone up is the appreciation of the stock market. This brings up an interesting issue from my point of view, and that is, what is the best way to rectify the inequality of wealth in this country? This is not an NAM position, it's my personal view as an economist. I think that workers should own more stock. And we've seen some movement in that direction. Many companies are paying their workers with more stock options. Quite a few of us as small investors have gotten into the market and done well. There is an opportunity for workers, as long as they are employed and are able to save and invest their income, to actually raise their wealth by investing in the stock market. And I think that the best way to reduce inequality in this society is, in fact, to get workers more into the stock market so that they own more national wealth.
Let me just jump in. And thank you for your thoughts, but after all is said and done, last year, CEOs were earning 200 times what their workers were making, Mr. Richards, as I understand it. CEOs saw including all forms of compensation. And you're right about stock options, but you also have to acknowledge that there are some very fabulous salaries out there for CEOs as well. You want to comment on the fact that the spread is 200 to 1, the largest in the world, that we have the most unfair distribution of wealth. You talked about distribution of wealth. The richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. What do you think about that?
Okay, supposing that back in 1989, workers had been offered large stock options in lieu of wages. In other words, companies had gone to workers and said, all right, we will give you stock options instead of the compensation you're currently getting, and these stock options will be tax favored, and you can put them into IRAs and so on and so forth. In the event that that had been done, given the appreciation of the stock market we've seen in the early 1990s, then workers would be much better off today than they are. To some extent, The reason we have so much inequality is that workers were not given the opportunity of getting into the stock market much
I do
earlier.
understand. You're still not quite answering my question, because stock options are important, but then they're not the only thing. There are areas of companies all over America cutting back on health insurance for workers today. Companies, and probably the National Association of Manufacturers, wants to create a situation where workers today who receive benefits are now going to be what are called independent contractors, which will be a continued lowering in their standard of living. So I'm asking you, very simply, does the NAM have any concern that we have the most unfair distribution of wealth and the most unfair distribution of income, that CEOs today make 200 times what their workers? Is that on your radar screen as an area of concern?
It is on our radar screen, and I have suggested a possible solution, and I stand by that solution. I think that workers have to be given stock because that way they'll be able to share in national wealth, and that if they are given stock, then the amount of inequality in future years will be reduced.
Okay. Now, we've heard last year, as you know, there was a big fight over here about whether or not we could raise the minimum wage more than 4 1/4. And some of us saw 4 1/4 as virtually a starvation wage, lowest the minimum wage that this country had had for 40 years, and we raised the minimum wage up to $5.15, and there were terrible predictions that the economy would collapse and no one would have any jobs and all that stuff, none of which has in fact taken place. Now, some of us think that given the fact that our low-wage workers are the lowest paid workers in the industrialized world, we're behind Italian low-wage workers and German low-wage workers, that maybe we want to raise the minimum wage again to make sure that everybody who works 40 hours in America does not live in poverty. How do you gentlemen stand on the need to raise the minimum wage again, to say to $6.50 an hour? I think Senator Kennedy has proposed something along those lines, and I have something in the House. Mr. Smith, do you want to comment on that?
Congressman, for most of the post-war era, the minimum wage was roughly 50% of the average manufacturing wage. It's still short of that target. It has been short of that target, I believe, since 1979. It's certainly appropriate to restore the purchasing power of the minimum wage at a minimum to that level, and then to index it so that we don't go through these disgraceful battles every few years where some American citizens argue that their brothers and sisters don't deserve a wage sufficient to raise their family.
Mr. Richards, what do you think? Can we do better than $5.15 an hour, or is that the...
At the current time, market events have really gotten ahead of the minimum wage. In many cases, even the less skilled workers are making a good deal more than the minimum wage.
Some cases.
Some less skilled workers are. The issue that you have to consider whenever you consider raising the minimum wage is that if you raise it beyond a given threshold, you'll end up pushing people out of work because you're raising costs on the kinds of businesses that employ low-wage workers, which are typically not manufacturing firms. They're typically places like grocery stores and restaurants with very constrained liquidity. In many cases, these firms are not paying their CEOs much. They're mom-and-pop type operations.
McDonald's and Burger King, I suspect,
Yeah,
compensate.
and in other words, the danger that you face in the minimum in raising the minimum wage is that you could end up throwing low-wage workers out of work if you raise it too high.
If I might,
Sure.
Gordon's argument ought to sound very familiar to you. It's what you heard last year.
Yes.
And the facts are in. We raised the minimum wage. It goes up again in about 6 weeks, and there's been not a ripple in the economy, but more people are taking home more money. It's hard to argue with that. Gordon's argument, it strikes me, is I suppose there's some level at which the minimum wage would be a job eater. But to argue that because if we raise the minimum wage to $16, we shouldn't raise it to $6 is simply fatuous.
I would agree with you. My last question, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. One of the issues that we don't talk about, and in fact it's amazing how little we do talk about in the Congress, but has always amazed me, is that with all of the booming economy and all of the new technology, it turns out that American workers are working many longer hours than they did 15 and 20 years ago. I think the figure is, I recall, about 160 hours a year more than was the case 20 years ago, because lower wages have forced people to work overtime 2 jobs or 3 jobs, as in the case often in the state of Vermont. Now, I know that in Germany, I think workers get 6 weeks paid vacations, throughout Europe, Sweden, France, so forth and so on. In this country, it is not uncommon for workers to be getting 1 week paid vacation, 2 weeks paid vacation. What about developing legislation which basically gives people more time off without cuts in pay so that we can create more decent paying jobs and give people an opportunity to experience family values rather than having to work all the time? Anyone want to comment on the overworked American?
Congressman, I think what we've seen in the last 2 decades is families using almost any means to keep up. First, they supplied more workers to the labor force. As we've seen, many more two-family households, we got 2 adult households become 2 earner households. Workers have added hours. This has allowed standards of living not to fall as rapidly as hourly compensation has fallen. This has become not simply an economic problem, but a social problem as well, and addressing it both statutorily and in the collective bargaining process is certainly appropriately on the agenda.
Sir?
As a market economist, I still think that decisions of that nature should be made between individuals and their employers, and that private agents should be able to arrive at employment contracts that are favorable to themselves. Many people, many families have a second wage earner for the simple reason that women want to participate in the labor force and earn more money. And I think that this is, in some ways, a very favorable development.
But you're not concerned, that's certainly true. But on the other hand, as Mr. Smith indicated, I think is obviously true, is there are millions of women who would prefer to stay home with the kids, who now have got to work in order to compensate for the decline in wages that the male has made. Is this not a concern that people are now, I mean, why are our workers, a figure that I saw is that our people are working 200 hours a year more than they are in Europe. National Association of Manufacturers concerned about that?
We are concerned, but we think that much of the downward pressure on real wages had to do with specific developments over the 60s and 70s. Specifically, you had the entry of the baby boom into the labor force, which meant that you had a temporary surplus of labor. You had events like the OPEC price shocks, which of course lowered wages very sharply. You also had deep recessions, which of course put downward pressure on wages. Now, under those circumstances, clearly some families were forced to have a second wage earner because their real wages were going down. At the same time, one development in the baby boom generation was that more people wanted to participate in the labor force and have careers, and I view that as a completely positive development. As we now enter into a situation in which we're reaching a very low rate of unemployment, we should also be able to sustain a higher growth rate for a long period of time. Chances are wages will begin to catch up, and people can then make whatever decision they choose regarding their participation in the labor force.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I know my colleague from Massachusetts had talked about the fact that